Awesome. Thank you, Diana. I really, really appreciate that. And you can see my screen okay? Just give me a thumbs up, Diana, if it's
Yes.
good.
Mhm.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining and welcome to today's session, which is Design Dynamics, Elevating UiPath Apps through UX Wireframing. So this is a topic I am very passionate about, as wireframes have saved me considerable time and effort on past projects during my earlier development career. Oh, sorry, let me close this reading being recorded and keep moving forward. So, a little about me before we get started. My name's David Kroll. I'm a UiPath Community MVP specializing on apps and RPA. I have roughly 15 years or so of experience building and delivering applications to real world businesses. I work for Ashling Partners. It's an intelligent automation services provider in this space, where I currently do a mix of solutions engineering and product marketing, which is an incredibly fun combination. I jokingly tell my friends that I'm a recovering application developer, as in my time as an engineer, I've made just a ton of mistakes, and I always tried to learn from those mistakes and help others not fall into those same pitfalls wherever I could, and had a lot of mentors help me as well. So I'm hoping that something you may hear from me today helps guide you through either a future or an existing project to help you become more successful with the UiPath platform. So thanks once again for joining. So to understand the importance of today's presentation and the material, I really want to start with a short story about Jake. So once upon a time, in a bustling tech city, there was a UiPath Apps developer named Jake, and Jake was known for his UiPath coding prowess, his love for coffee, and his ever-present headphones playing his favorite classical music. One fine Monday, Jake was assigned to develop an app for a major client. The client, eager to begin but vague in their expectations, described their dream app as innovative, user friendly, and a game changer. Jake knew that UiPath Apps would be a good fit for the client, so he recommended it and began building the application. This was going to be a slam dunk, or so he thought. So, as Jake dove into coding, he quickly realized the challenge. The client's description of their application was about as clear as a foggy morning in San Francisco. Without a complete without a complete plan or a visual guide, Jake's code became a maze of guesswork and assumptions. Days turned into weeks, and the app looked nothing like the revolutionary tool that the client had envisioned. It was more like a digital Frankenstein's monster, parts stitched together from multiple stakeholders without a cohesive design. Frustrated, the client bombarded Jake with changes. Make it more intuitive, they said. The interface doesn't feel right, they continued, and wrapped up a Friday sprint review with Jake's boss by saying, "This isn't what we expected." Jake's dream project turned into a nightmare of endless revisions. Sleepless nights were spent coding and recoding, fueled by an unhealthy amount of espresso shots. Then, while researching some of his struggles to find a better way, Jake stumbled upon a guide to wireframing and elevated requirements gathering. Intrigued, he delved deeper and learned about its magical powers in aligning developers with business visions. It all started to click, and Eureka, meowed his cat. The next day, armed with his newfound knowledge, Jake proposed creating wireframes to the client. Skeptical but intrigued, they agreed. Jake worked hard to sketch out each screen, flow, and interaction of the app. The wireframes were not just drawings, they were a language translating the client's vision into a visual blueprint. As if by magic, everything changed. The wireframes brought clarity and direction. The client's feedback became constructive and targeted. They were able to reiterate work on the user interface and agree on designs before development began. Jake's development pace accelerated, not with haste, but with purpose. He became a maestro, orchestrating code into a symphony of functionality and design. And the day the app launched, it was a total hit. It was exactly what the client wanted: intuitive, user friendly, and indeed a game changer. Jake became a legend in his office, not just for his coding skills, but for his wisdom and recognizing the power of wireframes. And from that day on, Jake always started his projects with wireframes, ensuring a smooth journey from concept to reality. And as for the client, they never overlooked the importance of wireframing again. So interested to learn more about this superpower. I'm happy you joined our session today because I'm going to go out there on a limb. I'm going to try to teach you some different tricks that I've learned so that you can be more effective with your clients and business units. And I can't wait to tell you all those different tricks for successful wireframing. So it's going to include breaking down what wireframing is, identifying some of the top wireframing tools in the market, tips on how to master using those tools, how to translate a wireframe into a functional UiPath app, and then 5 minutes for Q&A. We may spend more time here if needed to ask me any questions you have around the material. And then lastly, our conclusion with links to additional resources. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started here with an introduction to wireframing and when you would need to use it. So it may, in fact, be overkill for smaller applications where expectations are understood and in alignment. So how do you know when it's the right time to use wireframing? Well, the answer is if you're struggling with any of the issues on this screen. So for example, if you're building an app for a business unit and you as a developer feel lost about what you're trying to build from an interface standpoint, you don't know if they expect a portal page, a submit form, or a view, for example. Also, if the client or the party you're supporting is unable to provide clear instructions on what they are expecting you to create, and you struggle to receive feedback from that client that doesn't result in, heavy rework cycles, if you will. If the users complain about a poor user experience that doesn't meet their expectations, if the end user doesn't fully adopt your application, or if there's accessibility issues, this can happen in situations where you have visually impaired users, for example, that are struggling to use the interface. If you don't run into these issues, you probably aren't building big enough apps to require the wireframing, and it may not be necessary for you to be successful. But if you are running into any of these issues, and you're not currently wireframing in your projects, applying a proper wireframing strategy can truly make the difference on your next project. So let's dive into that, into the importance of wireframing and what sets it apart from, traditional user stories. So most developers work off user stories and other various requirements to build their applications, right? At the base level, user stories include a role definition, a goal, and a reason. And I've created several of these on this slide as an example. So for example, maybe a digital marketer wants to have an interface that helps them build out digital ad campaigns and plan their annual executions to do their job more effectively. Or maybe you're a financial analyst and you want an interface to review past year earnings, estimate potential tax implications in the following year to save on taxes where the company can. Or lastly, maybe you're an IT manager, you want an interface to really manage the work assignments to employees so that the team can be more efficient. While these stories are all helpful, they lack something behind them, right? They don't level set with the client what they want us to design, which often leaves both the developer and the client in the dark. In fact, each one of these examples I provided is really a loaded requirement that could be unpacked and could be dove into and turned into a series of user stories or a series of deep requirements around what they're trying to achieve. So the way I like to go through wireframing, right? I like to think, any wireframe that's worth its salt should really achieve the following. It should set those expectations and the direction around what the look and feel of the application will have. It should provide crystal clear control recommendations for different scenarios. So if you're picking a date or you're doing a lookup, that should be all intentional as a part of your design, and you should show that click-through process to do that lookup and select that value. It should provoke conversation. The best wireframes provoke conversation with the business stakeholders. This allows you, as the analyst or the developer, to negotiate between what they want and what is possible to provide, which is one of the most challenging aspects of application design. And lastly, for larger efforts, it can really serve as a foundational component to an actual design spec or a prototype to improve development velocity. So typically the order of operations and where to do wireframing in my eyes is really as follows. You do your requirements up front if you're doing waterfall, or maybe you're doing user stories if you're agile, and then you translate those into wireframes and get business feedback and sign off on those designs. And most importantly, once you have that sign off, you can work with the technical architect to align a deeper prototype for your application using those wireframes as the foundation to get started. So it really kind of fits. You almost see it as a puzzle piece where it connects on the left side as well as on the right side, with the left side being requirements and user stories that facilitates through the wireframe, and lets you get started with prototype development once everything is settled. So let's look at what it's like to build a wireframe and how quickly they can be created, compared to building out our application designs and development tools. So as you can see here, many of the interfaces for these wireframing tools are quite simple and straightforward. This tool in particular is Balsamic. This allows us to drag controls onto a canvas to plan out our designs and really clearly set expectations. So think of a wireframe like a sketch or almost an evolved form of whiteboarding. We're peeling back what we want our app to achieve, what it should look like, and setting that expectation before we write any code. If we need to make changes, either large or subtle, we can achieve that in just a few clicks versus having to redevelop our app and reconnect backend components when we want to make changes. So you can see here what we've designed in just a few seconds is just kind of a login screen and what we expect that to look like. It's pretty straightforward for us as application developers to take information like this and translate that into an application. And we now have a visual that we can look at where we're building visual outcomes, which is very important. So when I build wireframes, this is how I like to do it. I like to use a digital tool like the one I just showed you. I know some people that are old school and they still do it on pen and paper, and that's totally fine if you want to do it that way too. Although I would suggest having some way to upload that and attach it into your DevOps system so that you can kind of stay in alignment and share that digitally with your team. I do group my wireframes by application to keep them organized. So you have to think through the folder structure and the layout of how you want to organize the wireframes for different projects. I try to think through the functional approach for the application, and I'm not afraid to make assumptions in my design. This goes to the earlier point I was making about being thought provoking. Knowing, see, I know that the business will either like it or they'll ask for it to be modified. And I would rather put a design in front of them and say, this is what I recommend. Do you want to deviate from that? Versus asking them to tell me what they want, because sometimes they don't know what's possible and it can be hard for them to articulate what they want. Um, During this time period, I'm absolutely delighted if the business doesn't like my design. That's because the feedback is gold, and reiteration on the design is very, very appropriate at this stage. And at the end of the day, any feedback we're able to take and handle up front here in the wireframing means we're working towards what the business wants, and we're not wasting our time later in the development cycle. So, what are some of the best wireframing tools out there, and which ones do I personally recommend, having been doing wireframing for, gosh, at least 10 years? Um, so there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them out there. You can pick whichever one you like, and I will give you a list here. But it is important that it's something that you enjoy using and that's easy for you to use. If you work on a larger team, you may want to look into collaboration options for these platforms to see if you can collaboratively build wireframes together. That can be a really, really powerful way to get your wireframes out the door, especially if you have multiple analysts and developers on the same team. And also consider who is approving the final designs, right? If it's an executive team and you want to use a tool, um, if it's an executive team, you want to use a tool that is less focused on the sketching and the whiteboarding side, like a balsamic, and more focused on representing what the application will actually look like, which is more of prototyping and Figma. So that's kind of where I would divide those two buckets. And if we look at that, if we look at the general list of tools, you can see the difference in the designs on the bottom. I have links to these tools at the end of the presentation, but I highly recommend looking at some of these tools and using them to get started in your designs. I've moved across multiple companies in my career, and I continue to use a lot of the tools on this list across those companies. Just great skill set to have. Sketch and Balsamic are fantastic for drawing up quick and dirty wireframes. My personal favorite that I use is Balsamic. It does come with a free trial, I think. It's fairly affordable for an individual user like myself, which I also appreciate. But Balsamic is great for sketching out your design. Figma is more high fidelity. It's more user experience focused, more prototyping focus. It may be what you need though. If you're a professional UX designer, if you're working on a really large, sensitive, mission critical project with executive stakeholders, that's more of a situation where I would use Figma. If you build your wireframes in Figma, they are going to look higher fidelity, and you can see that on the bottom right of the screen here. It's going to look a lot more like what they would actually be working with and what they would actually be receiving, which you can see why that would be much more likely to be accepted by an executive stakeholder than the one on the left, which is more of kind of just a general visual of how we're trying to align things. And it's not necessarily representative of the end state of the application. Other tools that I've used are Lucid Chart. I've used that as well. That can be used in a pinch if you have it. But if it were me, I would pick either Balsamic or Figma, depending on who I'm working with and who I'm trying to impress. Um, Personally, the wireframes you're going to see today were all built in just a few hours using Balsamic. So now that you've kind of seen that overview of wireframing, how do we master wireframing in our projects, right? How do we apply that? So let's look at one of the use cases from earlier, which is that digital marketer who needs an application to help them manage their marketing campaigns. So in this example, this digital marketer wants to have an application that helps them do their job more effectively. And so that might include things like a dashboard with a view for planning ad campaigns over the next 12 months. They might need tools for creating and editing those different sets of advertisements and campaigns, including things like targeting, budgeting, and scheduling options, and an analytics section as well to track performance metrics. So, we start from there. We start from that request. Let's take that information. We try to build an interface around it using our experience and our background as developers. So we take chances and we don't worry if we're wrong because it's easy to fix, right? And most importantly, we don't write a line of code or create our app yet until we have that agreed upon design. So as you can see here, we've really taken this statement and we've tried to translate that into a visual interface. We're aligning the different interface forms visually. We're identifying the different types of fields that we might need to capture in design. And each organization, may have a different way that they do this. And in fact, business analysts may have a methodology that they apply to this, which is totally fine. And it's not meant to replace that by any stretch of the imagination. But if you're not actively doing wireframing, this is something that you can add in, and this is how you can do it. Um, but we want to make those interfaces easy and appealing, right? We want to show it to the business and the client before we build anything. That's really where we're going to save the most time in our project and get the most bang for our buck here. And we want to set expectations in the app. When we show someone the finished version of our application, or at least the MVP release, we want them to know what's coming. We don't want them to be surprised by the screen that's presented in front of them, and that's what this process is for. And it really protects you as a developer or as an analyst that's solidifying those requirements because we have this agreed upon design that the business has signed off on before you're going and committing those development hours. So to build this app, for example, maybe we need to separate it into several different wireframe pages to break it down. So here, for example, we may want to have a landing page that supports the ability to create new campaigns, edit existing campaigns, see relevant analytics if we are a manager, see running and previously executed campaigns, and maybe a button there at the bottom to manage access to the application. So, using the wireframing tool, you can see how I personally would approach this design. There's a lot of different UX philosophies out there, and the one that my personal favorite is the crap philosophy. Yes, you heard that right. When wireframing, especially when creating high fidelity wireframes, I think it's very important to follow the crap rule. Crap is an acronym. If you attended any of my sessions earlier this year, you've probably heard of this by now. I certainly didn't invent this, but it is a rule I live by when building applications and wireframes alike. So this rule is essentially a set of UX design principles that can really help to create effective and engaging visual designs. So CRAP is an acronym that stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So contrast really refers to the difference between elements in a design. Using contrast can help to create visual interest and hierarchy in your design. So, for example, using contrasting colors or font sizes can help to draw attention to important elements. This isn't something you need to do on a sketch design, but it is helpful if you're in Figma, right? And you're building more high fidelity, colorful wireframes. So, one example of doing that in this design on the right is with the button colors, which are heavily contrasted from the rest of the app. As an end user, you'll innately know that you can click on those buttons just by looking at it. Repetition refers to repeating elements throughout a design. So this can help to create a cohesive and consistent design. So, for example, using the same font or color throughout a design can help create unity around that. And you can see that being used here in our both in our top navigation actually, as well as in the middle of the section here, where we do not deviate from this overall design. Really helps us bring everything together visually, right? And then we have alignment. Alignment refers to the placement of elements in a design. So proper alignment can help to create balance and organization in a design. So, for example, aligning text or images to a grid can actually help to create a structured, sorry, and professional looking design. So you can see here how we aligned our bubbles under the section here to fit within this grid layout, which is going to make it easier to read, easier to use, and a little bit more predictable as it grows. And then proximity refers to the placement of related elements in the design. This may times people think this is common sense, but we've all used a tool that makes the element you need to click exist on the far opposite side of the screen. And this is made even worse with the advent of ultra wide monitors, where the buttons that you need to click may be all the way on the right of your screen, and everything you need to read to make your decision is all the way on the left. So really thinking through how to group those components together is really going to make things easier to understand, easier to use. So just something to be aware of there. And you can kind of see what we're doing here with the proximity with styles and formatting. Each one of these sections, everything you need to do around styles and formatting is right there. We want you to click the button, you can click it, and you can move forward. So by following these CRAP principles, wireframers can create designs that are engaging, effective, and easy to understand. So it makes them easier to convert into real world apps with high UX scores. So as I always say, strive to build crappy applications. All right. So we'll keep that philosophy in mind as we move forward here and create additional screens within our app. So, for example, maybe we want a new form to pop up when we click to create a new campaign wireframe from the landing page, right? So, when we click that little button on the landing page to create a new campaign, we want this form to show up, and we want to design a form that lets us create that new campaign and align notification parties by looking up who supports those specific clients in our CRM tool. It also supports, as you can see at the bottom, the ability to save a draft before publishing. So here you can really see we're sketching this together. We're starting to align the fields out a little bit. We're trying to think through, how might we layer in these different controls, and how do we want this end user experience to be, on this particular stage. For campaigns that are drafts or in flight, we need the ability to edit existing campaigns. So we've created this wireframe that shows our expected, behavior. So you don't have to rebuild all the interface components if you don't want to, though a lot of these wireframing tools let you copy paste where you need to. But you can use notes to annotate where necessary, like I've done here at the bottom to indicate we'll be bringing in all of the same fields from the Create a Campaign screen. Next up, we have our analytics wireframe. So if I was building this wireframe out, then I would ask the business to provide me, clear expectations on what they want to see in their report. This would really let me articulate that in the wireframe itself. I could, bring forward and surface those different reports and tell them more importantly where that data is coming from to create that report. Since we don't have that information, let's just make some assumptions. Let's throw it out there and we'll ask them for feedback in our design session. So for starters, we've assumed they want to bring in some data from CRM and track their budget and ROI for the campaigns that they're running in the annual fiscal year. And then in the application access level screen, this was that little button at the far bottom, we may show the ability to assign permissions and to either a person or a group and set the provided access level. A lot of times when I've been building an application that has something simple like this, it's often overlooked. And then when the business goes to open it, they're going, well, how come I can't add groups to permissions? Well, we didn't have that conversation. That was an assumption that was made up front and it wasn't, visualized where they only have the ability to see the people picker and they would have said something that would have said, oh, well, we expected to see groups as well. So this is just an example of how when you're doing wireframing, the business might go, oh, wow, there's something missing from that. Let's add that capability. And you think about how much time that can potentially save you over the course of a lengthy project. And that's why we're having today's session. Right. So essentially, this page functions as a self-service permissions pane, primarily used by the administrator of the application, so that they don't have to go in and do anything directly to provide access. So it's a very, very simple application, right? And only the smallest applications like this one would ever fit on a single slide in PowerPoint. Most application wireframes are in the 10 to 15 screens range, and they're also significantly larger in size, just literally like the virtual size of the wireframe is bigger. But you can see that as we create our wireframes, we're painting a picture of the application that we are going to create and the overall solution itself. So this is incredibly beneficial to make sure the applications come out looking the right way and meet expectations on that first pass or as close to the first pass as we possibly can. I'm sure you've had opinions as well as I've been showing you some of these forms and the way that the fields were aligned. And those opinions are great because it really helps us line up the design that best suits the problem statement. And especially in UI UX, there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat, so to speak. So that's wireframing in a nutshell. But I know what you're probably saying over there, which is, okay, that's great, but how do we take these wireframes that we're building and convert those into functioning UiPath apps, right? So I'm really glad you asked. When creating wireframes, it is really important to understand what your end goal is for the wireframing. So, for example, you may be trying to create a visual interface so that you can receive feedback from the business and set proper expectations on what you're about to build. That's really what we've been covering so far in the presentation. In those scenarios, we don't have to build anything in UiPath to actually support that conversation. We can do the majority of that through the wireframing tool itself. But what if you're a developer that's trying to use wireframes to create a blueprint for, future UiPath apps development? Well, in those scenarios, we recommend a slight change in approach represented by the blue path on the bottom. Um, we always recommend starting with the orange path at the top and completing that before moving to approach number two. Otherwise, you would waste a lot of time in the design and development stage. But we do have this path forward for building more of a prototype focused wireframe that is amazing for developers. So if we think about the latter stage of building a wireframe to help with development after the design has been approved, I consider that an application prototype. And we want to make some subtle changes to that, right? We want to have our designs focus on controls, layouts, and capabilities of the UiPath app to the best of our abilities. So this means we're not building designs that have control types that are unavailable in the platform, right? It means thinking through any workarounds that are necessary to make the app work in reality. And it means annotating and providing instructions to the developer within the wireframe itself, almost annotating that as you step through it, so the developer has a guide on that blueprint. And in the past, I've seen solutions architects or lead developers use these prototypes to really help provide that guidance to their team. It should always, though, be someone who understands the UiPath app product and its full suite of capabilities. And here's what an example, excuse me, here's an example I have of what I mean by the difference between wireframing, which is on the left, and prototyping, which is more on the right. So the example on the left is used more to set an expectation, to visualize and quickly reiterate on a design. The example on the right is a visual design, yes, but it's a specification, right? That shows how, as a developer, you would go about creating different controls in UiPath apps to arrive at the intended design. You can see here I've aligned container controls and provided notes on intended control types to achieve the interface. Prototyping is very similar, but it is much more intricate, which means that if you receive strong feedback and you've already done a ton of the prototyping side of the wireframes, it can impact your velocity in a significant manner. That's why we always say try to get alignment as early as possible from the business on those designs. Do everything you can so they don't change once you're in that prototyping phase. Um, I have seen many a developer make a huge mistake here. Do not skip wireframing and go straight to prototyping. If you do that, you will just spend a lot of unnecessary windows re-prototyping as you receive feedback, or you're just incredibly lucky and you manage to get what the business wanted on the first try, in which case I envy you and I should probably be learning from you. When we're trying to align a prototype specification to UiPath apps, right? We need to think through those components. So what are the major ones to consider, right? Well, behind every application, we're going to have data storage that is necessary for the app to function. Think about all the data that we need to save by session or for a particular application function that we're trying to create. Typically, I recommend using data service here, though it is possible, as we know, to hook up the UiPath app to a multitude of other data sources using RPA. We're going to have pages in UiPath apps, and we want to think through how we want to group our functionality there and how many pages we need to build within our app. Right? It's typically a good idea to try to reduce the amount of pages you have and keep it as low or as minimal as possible to reduce loading times. But if you're clever, you can often reuse pages using the page container capability in apps, which can be very powerful. Lastly, we have containers and controls. So containers, in my opinion, are the super control of UiPath apps. And we may want to build a wireframe that shows how we plan on creating the containers to support the interface. So if you refer back to the earlier prototyping side of this slide, you can see I've got containers drawn on the page. You see it on the top left of the different sections. So I've got my page container, which says that it will stack elements vertically as they're added onto the page canvas. I've got my container header with my different image and label controls within that. I've got a menu container that grows horizontally, right? So that I can add those button control icons. I just need to nest a container to achieve that. So you can kind of see how I'm aligning that super control to really build out that exact interface that I want to create. And the real question is, why do we do all this work, right? And, I was in a past session earlier this year with the UiPath team, and I talked a little bit about user experience. I talked about the user experience matrix. And the reason, that I personally wireframe is really to improve the user experience and ensure that we're building great applications that people will love to use. So for example, this five-factor scale really takes into account ease of use, visual design, navigation, responsiveness, and speed. Ease of use is super important, right? Because users want products that are intuitive. They want them to be easy to navigate. Visual design is important because users want products that are aesthetically pleasing and visually engaging, and they expect more of that as the technology has grown over the last decade. navigation and finding your bearings is really important because the users want products, that are easy to get around with and find what they're looking for. Responsiveness is huge. I know responsiveness and speed are less of a wireframing thing, more, and so we can move away from that. But responsiveness is really just making sure when I click the button, it actually does respect that click and it moves on to the next stage. And then speed could be speed of integration, speed of bringing the data in, overall loading speeds, and things like that as well. So while each of these factors are key, they ultimately contribute to the overall user satisfaction score. This is because a product can have all the right features and functions, but if the users aren't satisfied with the overall experience, they won't continue to use it unless they're forced to. And typically, I've found that satisfaction tends to be an average score of the above 5 elements. There could be times though where satisfaction is incredibly low, even when everything else is high. That might be a situation where an application doesn't correctly solve the business problem. Maybe it was a miss, right, on what they were trying to achieve. But you can start to see where wireframing can be beneficial as it impacts many of the attributes on this matrix, most notably the ease of use, the visual design, and the navigation. So that concludes the bulk of my presentation. I want to completely open it up to anyone who has feedback or any additional questions. If there's anything I can do or anything that I presented that I can clarify, just let me know. I'm happy to help.
Yeah, if you guys want to unmute yourself, feel free to ask any questions you might have.
You can also throw them in chat and I can try to handle them there as well. Awesome. I'll give it just another minute here. I know some folks might be typing some questions up, and if not, that's okay. You can always reach out to me on LinkedIn as well, if you want to have a one-on-one conversation about this stuff. It's a huge passion of mine, and I love UiPath Apps. I've been using it for quite a while. We do a ton of work with that over here at Ashling, so just enjoying it.
Hey, David, nice presentation.
Thank you.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
What would a typical timeline look like for you? Just of how much time would you spend on wireframing, and then how much time would you spend on prototyping, in relation to then later on how much time do you actually spend on developing? You can talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. That's a really good question. The way I would approach it is if I was working on a larger, more important application that I have to get right, I would spend even more time on wireframing. And I can try to quantify that for you in the sense of, if you think you're going to have, a 2 to 3 week sprint cycle, you might want to spend at least a day or two on wireframing within that sprint cycle for a large project. You may want to front load the wireframing by putting that in before your user stories are actually developed that you're assigning in the Agile sessions. You may want to front load that as a part of the user story itself. So you're essentially going in, you drag in the user story that you want to build, and you see the wireframe with it at the time you do that. The most effective teams I've seen appear to do it that way, but they're doing that wireframing work often up front. And the only drawback to doing it that early is often you might be wireframing things you're never going to build because they don't get accepted into the sprint. The alternative is, of course, you take the items that have been accepted for the sprint and you take a moment within your development cycle to actually go and wireframe those out. There are some challenges with doing it that way as well, but depending on your appetite for risk, you can do it one way or the other. Does that answer your question, or do you want me to clarify anything further?
No, makes a lot of sense. Basically, the hypothesis is that the more time and the more effort you spend up front, the easier it gets down the line. Yeah.
I wouldn't worry too much about wireframing for smaller applications unless you have what I would call an unwieldy stakeholder who it can be difficult to pin down. If you have a product owner who maybe changes their mind but doesn't tell you, wireframing can be a great way to pin them down and make sure that they hold true to what you've agreed upon earlier.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. And let me see if any other questions came in chat. I think we're good. So I'm going to go ahead here and move forward. And again, open offer on LinkedIn if anyone wants to connect. I've got the following wireframing tools here. I believe most of these have free trials. You can actually get in there, try them out. I know at a bare minimum, Balsamiq and Lucidchart both have those free trials. If I was going to be doing wireframing for a significant amount of time with UiPath Apps products, what I would actually do is I would go into the wireframing tool and I would build out the different controls that come by default in the UiPath Apps platform. This is something I'm looking to do early next year, is actually build this and release it to the community, but it would allow you to import a control set from UiPath Apps into your wireframing tool, so into Balsamiq, and you would have all of the pre-built controls that you can typically drag and drop in from apps, just to kind of, you know, reinforce what the platform is capable of doing and make sure we don't accidentally try to create a wireframe of something that maybe is in development and hasn't been released yet. So very exciting stuff, but I love wireframing. I love doing it. In fact, when I gave UiPath feedback on apps, I used Balsamiq to identify the things that I wanted to see improved in the platform over time, which allowed me to take some really advanced requirements and really simplify them, I think, for the product team. So it was a lot of fun to do that. Very useful tool in a lot of different scenarios, not just the application development cycle. All right. Last call for any questions, and then I'll hand it back over to Diana. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, David. Great presentation. You guys, and if you have any other topics that you'd like David to talk about in the future, please drop them in the chat.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
I always take
everybody.
requests.
Talk to y'all later.
Yep. Take care. Thank you so much.